Walk me through the difficulties it is for the FTC to play a role here in trying to, because I think I think you tried, I think you're trying, I think there's some form of this, of your successor, at least keeping some of these cases going. But my great fear is that we're going to get resolution and it'll be obsolete tech that we're able to, we're finally able to resolve some issues, but it's no longer the prominent thing. Meanwhile, this consolidation of power has destroyed the entire media ecosystem.
It's a very valid fear. And candidly, I think enforcers and policymakers in DC were generally slow to kind of recognize the enormous problem of tech consolidation, right? In the early 2000s, there was almost this like religious zeal that these tech companies were spreading, this idea that there were these revolutionary companies that were just going to be, really fantastic for people. And there was almost like this, move fast and break things type mentality. And there was a sense that these markets move so quickly that if anything, it's better to get out of the way, that the government should be as hands-off as possible. And I think what we've seen is that there were enormous costs to that, right? We now have just a handful of companies that are controlling key arteries of commerce, key arteries of communication. And that functionally means that these companies are getting to call the shots on swaths of business activity, right? You noted they're getting to effectively call the shots on what content gets heard or seen with no transparency and no accountability, right? Because there's no competition in the market. If you don't like what a Google algorithm is doing, you don't really have that much choice. And that's what was so eye-opening for me, is that there were actually thousands upon thousands of businesses that were enormously alarmed and disturbed about the power that these tech companies had accumulated, because they could only, their access to customers was entirely dependent on the whims of an Amazon or a Google. And I would have companies tell me, I woke up today, for some reason on Amazon, I went from page 1 to page 7, or on Google from page 1 to page 7. And if this does, I don't know why, nothing changed on my end, but if this doesn't get fixed, my business is going to go bankrupt. And, I remember there was a business who was quoted saying, Google has more power than the government, right? The government can tax me, but if Google changes an algorithm, my business is going to go under. And so I think people started to realize just the enormous power these companies have, if it's not held to account, can just be extremely abusive.
Let's go to something. How did we get to the point where I have to consent for my data to use an app versus the app having to consent to me to get data? Like, do you see what I mean? Like, we've totally reversed the permission structure, which is I'm being coerced to give up something to use a product, right? To use a Google app, or simply to update a product I've already purchased. But if I want a free update, I've got to, instead of, I got to give something in return. And there's no alternative. Like, I could say, hey, I don't want to give you this data. Can I buy it? Right? They're not even giving me access to this updated version of the app. How did we get here where they're not asking us permission, but essentially we're being coerced?
It's a really important question. And a key moment was in the early 2000s, where some of these businesses started adopting business models that were premised effectively on surveilling you and harvesting all of your data, right? Companies like Google, Facebook decided they were going to monetize their companies not by charging customers in terms of dollars, but instead by collecting data on them and then selling that to advertisers. And what that did from a business perspective was create an incentive to collect as much information on you as possible, right? And so they're collecting it when you're on their website, but they're also collecting it across the internet. Now it can be combined with data collected on your phone, including your precise geolocation. And there's just a huge business incentive because that's how they make money. And it's really striking because, America has a long tradition of being very skeptical of government surveillance. But
Mhm.
we are now increasingly being surveilled by these private companies. And we don't know what's happening with that data. At the
Mhm.
FTC, sometimes found it was actually being sold just to the highest bidder, even if that meant selling it to foreign adversaries. And sometimes it is sold to the government or used by the government. And so
Right.
it seems like there's this whole workaround. And, you know, companies have adopted this notice and consent model where they think if they just present you these long terms of service and you
Right.
press agree that that means you're consenting, but we all know that's a fiction. And as you noted, we have to use these services to navigate day-to-day life, and so it does feel like coercion.
Well, the South Park boys probably have the best illustration of what happens with the agreement. They did a whole episode. I have no idea how familiar with that, but I recommended. They did this like a decade ago, sort of mocking the automat. What do you mean you didn't read your permits and services? And now one of the boys ends up being a human experiment for Apple to become a human centipede iPad or something like that. I mean, it's absurd, but it was really well. It was satire done exactly to point out this absurdity of terms and conditions and the fact that nobody actually reads it and you have no idea what you've just consented to. And this idea that, oh, it's on you. Oh, come on. Like that's not realistic. Um I what let's this you just talked about the hands-off approach that essentially government decided to take on the tech industry in the first 2 decades of the century. Here we are at AI at this moment. And that is exactly the same conversation. All these AI had don't regulate us, right? And we just saw that bill. There was going to be an attempt to put a moratorium on state-based regulations for 10 years. As soon as it popped up, there were there were at least a few people howling about it, and it got stripped out. A reminder: sometimes transparency is still the best disinfectant that you have on sometimes on bad policy. Um, but it certainly looks like we're about to do the same, make the same mistakes with AI that we made with social media.
It's a key risk. And, you know, I think we've seen some interesting dynamics with AI where oftentimes these moments of, you know, technological advances and breakthrough advances are actually a moment where the market opens up and you get new players. And so it was actually, you know, Microsoft being disciplined by antitrust that allowed
Mm-hmm.
the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Googles to come in and enter more competition. The risk we're seeing now is that this technological revolution will instead allow the existing giants to just expand and double down on their power.
Well, who
And
else? Let's talk about that real quick, because who could start up an AI company on their own right now? You need to have so much money to get power, so much money to get the computer, actual electricity, computing power. The barrier to entry is super high. This is not. So the only companies that can afford it are the companies that already have the power and the resources, right?
That's exactly right. Like kind of every step of the way, you're basically dependent on the whims of these existing giants. And I think the other really incredible component here is that a lot of these models are being trained on people's data, right? We were just talking about consent and the lack of consent. I mean, when I was at the FTC, we were talking to creators, writers, graphic designers who said, I just woke up one day and my life's work had been ingested by this model that is now spitting out stuff that is competing with me. And it was trained on me and nobody asked me and nobody paid me. How is that fair? Right. And so we've already seen, what some people would call theft in terms of just how much of that information has already been ingested and monetized
Mm-hmm.
without any consent or compensation. I think the other potential abusive practice we could see is this idea of surveillance pricing, where not only is your data being collected on you, but then it is being used against you to price as much as you will pay. So imagine you had a death in the family and you got an email notice about where the services are going to be. You go to buy a plane ticket and the airline company knows you are trying to get to a funeral. It's an emergency and maybe they'll overcharge you. Right. And I think that's going to be one of the next frontiers of potential abuse that we have to be on guard for.